So recently, I saw this photo from Kenya that messed with my head way more than any monster or ghost story. It is just a farmer's field and a little paved road in the background, and right through all of it runs this crack. Not a little pothole, not some cute little trench. The land is literally split open. There is a section where the asphalt just drops out of sight. You can see the layers of dirt like a slice of cake, and people are standing on both sides staring at each other across this gap like, okay, that was not here last week. The crazy thing is, at ground level it looks like a one-off disaster. Heavy rain, bad drainage, maybe the road was built cheap. But when geologists look at that same scene, they do not see a sinkhole. They see a symptom of something much bigger. That crack is one tiny little scab on a wound that runs from the Red Sea down through Ethiopia and Kenya into Tanzania and way beyond. That part of Africa is literally pulling itself apart. The way one of the scientists described it on a show was perfect. He said, imagine you are looking at a crust of bread on top of a pot of stew. If the heat underneath focuses in one spot, the crust stretches, it thins out, and eventually it tears. The East African rift is where the crust has been stretched so far for so long that it has started to split. It is not a metaphor. There are actual scars across the landscape that line up into this massive pattern. On a satellite map you can trace it, long valleys, lines of volcanoes, lakes that all sit in a sort of trench. It is the continent coming apart in slow motion. One of the wildest stories tied to this comes from Ethiopia, from this place called the Afar region. If you ever see video from there, it looks like another planet. It is this burned, cracked desert with steam coming out of the ground and these bright yellow and green pools of acid. In the mid-2000s, scientists were camped out there because they knew the crust was under intense stress. The plates under that area were being pulled in different directions, and magma was already very close to the surface. They had instruments on the ground, they had satellites watching from above, waiting for something to happen. What they actually got was more dramatic than anyone expected. There was a swarm of little earthquakes, dozens of them, then a bigger one. People in the camps felt the ground shudder. When they went out the next morning, there were brand new cracks in the earth. You could walk up to them and look down into this jagged canyon that had not existed the week before. In some places it was a few meters wide, in others just a narrow slit, but it ran for many kilometers across the desert. What had happened underground was like a slow-motion version of a volcanic eruption turned sideways. Instead of a classic mountain blowing its top, a sheet of magma forced its way into the crust horizontally, prying the rock apart. The rock did not explode, it just separated and dropped like someone had quietly pulled a book off a tightly packed shelf. The surface had to adjust, so it broke. Scientists mapped that event and basically said, we just watched in real time what usually takes place over lifetimes. That crack in Afar is a tiny first step in the birth of a new ocean. The rock underfoot is not just sitting there, it is drifting. On one side you have what they call the Nubian plate, which carries most of Africa to the west. On the other side you have the Somali plate, which carries the chunk that has Somalia and bits of Ethiopia and Kenya and so on. Those two blocks are very slowly moving away from each other. You could stand there your whole life and never notice, because the speed is more like your fingernails growing than anything dramatic. But stretched over a few million years, that adds up. The crack in Kenya I was talking about earlier, the one that ate the farmer's field and broke the road, popped up along one of these ancient fault lines. It was not the first time that land had moved. That line in the ground is an old boundary, carved deep into the crust, and heavy rain just helped the surface collapse along it. The part that freaks people out is not the erosion. It is the realization that the land is already pre-cut. You are living on top of an old scar that can open again. Think about what that means in human terms. There are whole towns sitting inside that rift valley. Nairobi is not that far from the line. There are farms, highways, railways. People are building houses on what looks like good flat land, and 50 kilometers below them there is this geologic tug-of-war going on. On one side, the crust is being dragged one way. On the other side, it is being dragged another way. Between them, the rock stretches like old taffy. That stretching does a few big things. First, it thins the crust. Imagine taking a thick piece of dough and pulling it from both ends. It gets longer and thinner, right? As it thins, hot rock from deeper down has an easier time rising. That is where the volcanoes come from. East Africa has some of the most famous peaks on Earth. Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, and they are not random mountains. They live along this zone where hot material from the mantle below has broken through. Second, as the crust buckles and drops, you get long, deep valleys. A lot of them fill with water and become lakes. Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, those giant rift lakes that look like inland seas, they sit in these dropped blocks of crust. They are incredibly deep and old. Fish evolved there that live nowhere else. Whole human cultures have grown up along those shores, fishing, farming, telling stories about spirits in the water, all because the continent long ago developed a crack in that spot. Third, you get earthquakes. Not the kind of apocalyptic ones you see in disaster movies, but enough to rattle houses, crack walls, wake people up at night. When one bit of the stretched crust finally slips a few centimeters to relieve tension, the energy that has been stored releases as shaking. In parts of Ethiopia and Kenya and down through Tanzania, there are entire communities who have grown up with that quietly in the background. A rumble here, a small crack there, some hot springs where the ground is broken enough for water to circulate near magma and come back boiling. Now zoom way out for a second. The East African Rift is part of a bigger setup at the northeastern corner of the continent, where three big fractures meet. One leads up the Red Sea, one goes out through the Gulf of Aden, and the third dives down through Africa. That junction is like a three-way tear in a shirt. At two of those arms, the tearing has gone so far that seawater has already rushed in. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden are basically filled in rifts. The third arm, the one through Africa, is still mostly dry land, but it is following the same playbook. You can play this forward in your head. If the plates keep moving apart, the land between them will continue to thin. Parts will drop so low that ocean water will eventually spill in, either from the Red Sea or from some future connection. Over tens of millions of years, what is now a valley with lakes and volcanoes turns into a narrow sea, then a wide one. The flake of land on the eastern side, the bit with Somalia, the Horn of Africa, stretches of Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania becomes its own mini-continent, separated from the rest of Africa by a brand new ocean basin. There are those artists' impressions where they show a future Earth with a long blue scar, cutting through East Africa, coastlines shifted, islands where there used to be highland. It is not some prediction for next century. You and I will never see it. But geologically, that is the road we are on. The crack in that Kenyan farmer's field is a pixel in a very big picture. I love the human scenes that come out of this stuff. There was a story from one of the villages near one of the Kenyan cracks where people were just sitting at home one afternoon and began to hear this deep, popping sound. Not thunder, not a truck, more like the sound when ice starts to break on a frozen lake, but coming from under the house. Some of them ran outside and watched the ground slump. They said it was like watching an animal exhale. The earth sagged a little, then tore, and a trench opened across their yard. Fences fell in. A chicken coop went halfway down. The road on the edge of the property buckled and dropped. The land did not swallow whole cities. It moved just enough to remind everyone that the foundation they thought was solid is, in a very slow, very patient way, soft. Imagine trying to explain that to your grandparents. Yes, the land is splitting. No, it is not going to give us a seafront property next year. Yes, the scientists say this is normal. No, normal does not mean it is not terrifying when your front step suddenly tilts. The scientists working there do not just parachute in, take photos, and leave. They plant little metal markers in the ground, tie them into satellite positioning systems, and watch as those markers drift apart by tiny amounts each year. They map which faults are active, which ones are likely to move next. They drill into old lava flows and sediments to figure out how often big earthquakes have happened in the past. It is like reading a diary written in rock. And then there is the other side of it, which is weirdly hopeful. The rift is dangerous, yes. It can crack roads and swallow houses. But it also brings things people need. Those big rift lakes are water reservoirs in a region that can be brutally dry. The volcanic soils can be incredibly fertile. Farmers work land around Mount Meru and Mount Kilimanjaro because the ash and weathered lava make the ground rich. Hot springs provide warmth, salt, minerals. People have used those forever without knowing there's a tectonic story underneath. For them, it is just the place where water comes out warm and you can heal sore joints. There is a good chance some of the earliest humans walked along these same valleys. Fossils and old stone tools in places like the Omo Valley and Olduvai Gorge sit right in the rift system. Early hominins were probably already dealing with this broken landscape, using the lakes for water, the cliffs for shelter, the open ground for spotting predators. So when you look at that crack and think, the continent is splitting in two, you also have to remember this is the same set of fractures that may have helped shape us. The scary headlines always make it sound like Africa is about to rip down the middle tomorrow. That is not how this works. Plates move on the scale of millimeters a year. The dramatic stuff we see, a road falling in, a new crack opening, is usually the surface expressing a very small adjustment in that giant system. The real action is deep and slow. Rocks hundreds of kilometers down are creeping and flowing like very thick syrup. That flow pulls on the plates above like currents in a river tugging at ice flows. There is something humbling about that. You can stand on a lookout over the Rift Valley, stare out at this long line of cliffs and volcanoes and lakes, feel the wind, watch the clouds, listen to goats bleating below. Nothing feels like it is moving. A lizard bakes on a rock. A truck crawls along a dusty road. It looks timeless. But if you could speed it up, if you could watch a time lapse over a few million years, that whole scene would change. Cliffs would tilt and collapse, lakes would shift, volcanoes would grow and then erode. The valley would widen, and eventually seawater would glitter where now there is dust. When people ask, what does it mean that Africa is splitting? The honest answer is both very boring and very dramatic. Boring, because for any individual person, nothing much changes. Your life will not be extended or shortened by the plates drifting a few millimeters. Dramatic, because we tend to imagine continents as fixed, eternal things. Discovering that the ground under you is in the middle of a very slow breakup forces you to recalibrate what solid means. I like thinking of that farmer in Kenya, standing at the edge of the new crack, looking down at layers of soil he never knew existed. On one level, he is just pissed. His land is damaged, his house might be at risk, the road to town is cut. On another level, he has accidentally gotten a front row seat to a geologic process people usually only see drawn in textbooks. That line in his field is connected to volcanoes hundreds of kilometers away. It is connected to lakes teeming with fish. It is connected to ancient fault lines, the guided rivers and shaped where people settled. That is how the East African Rift works. It is not one big catastrophic tear. It is thousands and thousands of tiny shifts, cracks, tilts, and drops spread out over a time period that makes our entire history look like a weekend. Every once in a while, one of those shifts is big enough to break a highway or open a trench through somebody's living room, and we get a headline. The rest of the time, it is just the planet doing its thing under our feet. The idea that this will one day become a new ocean is not fantasy. Every major ocean basin on Earth started as a rift. The Atlantic was once a crack in a supercontinent. The Red Sea was once a valley. If you could rewind the clock, you would watch continents bunk together into one big mass, then slowly tear apart again along new lines. Africa is in one of those tearing phases in the east. The continent is essentially drafting its own exit plan for a piece of itself, and it is writing that plan in rock. So the next time you see a scary headline about a giant crack in Africa, or a video of a bus driver stuck at the edge of a broken road, remember what is underneath that moment. It is not just bad luck. It is the visible edge of a process that has been ticking away since before our species even thought about walking upright. The continent is stretching. A new ocean is trying to be born. And a handful of people and cameras just happened to be there on the afternoon when the ground remembered to move.